Oh, şükran gelsin.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, you can just take this.
For those of you who are in the middle, move up front a little bit. There's still empty seats. There's a lot of people coming in. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. Alhamdulillah, indeed, all praise is due to Allah. We praise Him, we seek His help, we seek His forgiveness, and we seek refuge from our own soul and our own wrongdoings. Allah is the one who guides us, and to Allah we return. Allah, whoever Allah guides, no one can misguide. May we all in this room be of those who are guided by Allah in our lives always. As we get situated and calm down, alhamdulillah, I think we didn't even expect the room to fill up like this. Jazakallahu khairan. Thank you for joining us here today. The topic in this room is Muslim responses to the challenges of modernity. If that is the topic you are expected to hear, you are in the correct room. If you were looking for a different topic, then inshallah you should just stay here anyway, and you're welcome to join us. We will begin with our team speakers, and we have time for question and answer at the end, inshallah. So we'll do about 10 minutes each, inshallah, in question and answer at the end. If he has questions in writing, you may pass it to one of the organizers, and the questions are in writing as we progress with the session, or you can ask already at the end. First, I'd like to welcome Dr. Marcia Hermanson. Her paper will be on the ability of the modernist liberal Islam to meet the challenges of modernity. Dr. Marcia Hermanson is Director of the Islamic World Studies Program and Professor at the Theology Department in Loyola University, Chicago. She teaches Islamic Studies, and she also teaches in the Academy Study of Religion. She received her PhD in Arabic and Islamic Studies from the University of Chicago under the supervision of Fazlur Rahman, scholar, and her areas of expertise include Sufism, Islam in South Asia, Islamic thought, and gender studies. Join me in welcoming Dr. Marcia Hermanson.
Assalamu alaikum. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. The theme of today's panel is Muslim responses to the challenges of modernity. 10 minutes, I'm going to have to speak fast, so please bear with me, and I'll be running through the slides very quickly. So if you feel like reading them, read away. I won't be able to read them all. My topic to start off, and I'm hoping to do a bit of a general framework along with this specifically addressing Islamic modernism / liberalism and the challenges of modernity. So what are the challenges of modernity? And realize there's a difference between modernism and modernity. Modernity is a condition. We are living in modernity, whether you like it or not. You are modern now, modern in the material sense of living in that condition. But what about mentality and ideas? There we get into the realm of modernism. Modernism is modern is good, and we should embrace it. So what have been some of the challenges of modernity for Muslims? One, in modernity, reason and science are considered the main sources of truth. Moderns tend to have, if you go to university, one of the things we are to expose and foster in our students is a historical, excuse the typos, historical critical approach. So a historical consciousness. We realize, for example, that things change over time and that human activity engenders such changes. Particularly in the case of Muslims, we are in modernity experiencing the domination of the West, and particularly the legacy of colonialism and westernization. And of course, we all know in modernity, there's massive social and material change, right? Which I can't, from the Industrial Revolution on until the present, until IT and chatbots and so on. So with modernity, we have mass education. Not just the case of Muslims, but imagine, Muslim societies at the beginning of the 1900s rate, maybe 5%, right? And you have a huge exponential rise in literacy. People can read themselves, not just male literacy, but in most societies, female literacy, even up to the university level. All these universities were founded in the 1960s, 1970s around the Muslim world. So that is a huge change, as well as changes in gender expectations with modernity. Modernism, if you hear, sometimes these terms, they overlap and it can be confusing. For example, in the West, modernism refers to a movement in arts and literature, which Britannica terms, quote, the search for an authentic response to a much changed world. And I quote that because I think it works for Muslims as well. The Islamic modernists saw themselves as rising to the challenge of interpreting and understanding Islam in this rapidly changing world. And they tended to be scholars and intellectuals, not drawn from the ranks of the ulama, although some of them had a fairly deep traditional Islamic education. Modernism is not the same as secularism. The modernists did not want to remove religion. They wanted to keep their faith. And in their experience of modernity, they felt that interpretation, if you will, ijtihad, had to occur in terms of that faith, to be plausible, if you will, for them. So this is a quick flash of Islamic movements in modernity, some of which are going to be touched on in our panel.
Remember, my mission is only to talk about modernism and liberalism, but we also have political Islam, nationalism, pan-Islamism. And then I dig a little deeper here. If you look at this slide, I'm showing the trajectory. So what is the history of Islamic modernism? Beginning in the late 1800s. So Muslims are being exposed and reading, going to Europe, meeting Europeans, being colonized by Europeans, seeing European critiques, for example, of the Bible. Take a figure like Sir Syed Ahmed Khan in South Asia, at the time in India. He is hanging out and doing, really rigorous work, looking at studies of the Bible that were being done. And then he starts looking at the Quran and the Hadith and using some of that historical critical methodology. Now, you notice we use the term modernism/liberalism. Why? Because modernism, the term, kind of fell out of favor. Like nowadays, if you said, oh, I'm a modernist, it would be, sort of, huh? Because it's no longer fashionable. Why is it no longer fashionable or maybe even rigorous to say a modernist? Because we're postmodern now. You're a modernist, you kind of go, what's the difference between modern and postmodern? Well, in modernity, there was like, we now have the automobile and science, and we are going to cure all the ills of humanity, and we're going to be more rational, and it's going to be a better world. And then what happens in the 20th century? The world wars, the atom bomb, more hatred and violence than ever. So modernity kind of loses its luster, right? As something to aspire to in modernism. So liberalism. So sometimes the term is used, Islamic liberals, which of course has its own baggage. So here's the trajectory, Islamic modernism, and notice the, sort of the time period. So Muhammad Iqbal, who is sometimes considered a modernist, among other things, he's very multifaceted, passes away in 1938. And then we have figures that you might term Muslim liberals. Dr. Fazlur Rahman, who was right here in Chicago, originally from Pakistan, and he passed away in 1988. Ali Shariati, ideologue of the Iranian Revolution, passed away in the 70s, and now we still have with us Javed Hamidi, Abdul Karim Surush. And the reason that I put Islamism and progressive Islam, I don't have to discuss them in any detail in this presentation, but they are outcomes or derivatives of the modernist liberal approach. What is and I'm going to leave tradition because I see the clock is ticking to our next speaker, but that's also a fascinating term. And we can maybe discuss it in the question period, traditional. But I do like to say, if you say somebody is traditional, it can have many meanings. Like, are you traditional because you live in the same village that your ancestors have lived, and you're not really thinking about your identity as a Muslim? Well, that's a luxury that very few Muslims have today. Most Muslims are thinking about, how should I be Muslim? Once you've asked that question, maybe you're no longer traditional. But you might be traditionalist. In other words, as a Muslim, I want to be traditional. But then, of course, you're already a traditionalist. But I must leave that point aside and say, what are the characteristics of Islamic modernism/liberalism? Using reason in interpreting scripture. That's why they're sometimes called neo-Mu'tazilites. Using historical criticism. Did it make sense for this particular report to have been transmitted in that time? Promoting education, not being anti-Western, supporting women's rights, and calling for a renewed ijtihad. So I only have 2 minutes left. This is going to be really fast, okay? So among the modernist liberals are Sir Syed, who I already mentioned, Muhammad Iqbal, Ali Shariati, Fazlur Rahman, and actually already said this. So I wish I could tell you the story of Sir Syed Ahmed Khan, but hey, it's only 2 minutes. I mentioned that he did this, a rational historical interpretation of both the Quran and the Hadith. He founded the famous Aligarh Muslim University. Going to be taught. So that's the way the modernists saw it. we need the best of both worlds. Here's Muhammad, because he said that each of movement in Islam. Okay. Ali Shariati had a modern, he wanted to make Shiism and the heroes of the Islamic tradition relevant for the Muslims of today. So, for example, Fatima, his book, describes the Prophet, peace be upon both of them, as an existential heroine who was true to herself. So bringing in factors from the past, honoring these figures, but also making them relevant, relatable for the Muslims of today. Now, I better move. I said these other movements, you may have heard of them: feminism, progressive Islam, liberation theology, the Green Dean, all of these would in some sense be derivatives. This is my last slide. The ability of modernists to meet the challenges of modernity. So you have sort of two sides of it, right? Good modernism, bad modernism. So good modernism, the positive contributions. It was a way for Muslims to search for authenticity and maintain their faith in the contemporary period. It also allowed answers to questions like polygyny, i.e. multiple marriage, or slavery. In other words, there is a way to understand that context to these practices and that historical context has moved on. Okay, which is a powerful argument. Now, there's a counter argument, which I can't go into. Positive in reviving and renewing ijtihad. You know, even the discourse about maqasid al-sharia, you know, at some point you have to say that either the sharia, it is what it is, or you have to use some reason and say, why is it like it is? And once you start doing that, you're kind of shading into modernism. Also, modernists appreciate and perhaps embrace cultural and interpretive diversity. So it is a way for Muslims to live in pluralist societies. So what are the criticisms? Hey, modernism is a slippery slope. I mean, today you say, okay, no slavery and no multiple marriage, but tomorrow you might say, astaghfirullah, why do salat? You know, because history has moved on, right? So who gets to decide where history has moved? Also, ijtihad. Can you have like rogue ijtihad? Like, I'm a mujtahid, you know, so that is another criticism. It kind of circles around the traditional ilm process. And finally, the modernists are critiqued, and we might say they, in a sense, failed to move the rest of societies along with them because they are viewed as being elitist. Yeah, these are great ideas, but did they uplift the status of the poor? Did they, you know, reform their societies, or were they just becoming westernized and not doing the heavy lifting that needed to be done at home? And that's the end. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Marcia Hermanson. Let me take this down. Okay. Inshallah, we will go straight into our next speaker. We have with us Sheikh Dr. Yahya Rose. His topic will be on spiritual and moral salvation of the modern human beings. Sheikh Dr. Yahya Rhodes is the founding director of Al-Maqasid, an Islamic seminary, who has a vision to facilitate the realization of Islam, Iman, and Ihsan through immersion in the prophetic inheritance. And at Respect Graduate School, we are blessed to have him only like 20 minutes away from our organization as well. Shortly, so Sheikh Yahya has traveled to Mauritania to pursue study in traditional Islamic sciences with one of Mauritania's greatest scholars, Murabit al-Hajj. He then went on to spend several years in Tarim, in Hadramaut, studying at Dar al-Mustafa, and currently is based in Pennsylvania. we would like to, sorry, let me add also that he holds a bachelor's in Near Eastern Studies from the UC Berkeley, an MA in Islamic Studies from the Graduate Theological Union, and a PhD in Theology and Religious Studies from the University of Cambridge in England. Let me welcome Shaya here with us.
Might have to lean over a bit here. I think that turned off there. Bismillah. They can hear me. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah wa salatu wa salam ala Rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. Can everybody hear me at the back? I'm a little bit taller than everyone else. I'm not so good at projecting my voice, but I will try. So alhamdulillah, it is a blessing to be here, and I thank you, Dr. Hermanson, for her presentation. And to be right to the point, I know time is limited. I wanted to, as a first task, deal with a little bit on terms. And we had previously saw the distinction and heard about the distinction between modernity and modernism. In general, that throughout this short time that I have with you all, I will refer to modernity in the broadest sense, in the sense of these circumstances and ideas that are a part of the present age in which all of us live. And surely that once you open up the route for that modernism, thinking of this as a way of thinking, that is a huge can of worms and a lot of discussion will surely entail. And so essentially you and I have inherited a world in which we were all born, and we are all products of our environment. And when we speak about these realities, I think it's very important to always root our discussions in religious terminology. I like to always think about everything that we can potentially think about in relation to our religion. And one of the ways that we can do this is to look into an oft-neglected, what you could call actually a science of Islam, that was initially referred to as alamat as-sa'a, the signs of the end of time, which of course are rooted in one of the most important hadith of all that we've learned from the time that we were young, the hadith Jibreel, but we tend to only focus on the first part of that hadith. The first part of that hadith speaks of Islam, Iman, and Ihsan respectively. Now, one of the ways, if you would analyze this, you could think about these three as the arkan al-bina. These are the building blocks, if you will, of a believer. But there's something else mentioned in this hadith, and we tend to gloss over it. And the fourth aspect was the alamat as-sa'a, when the Prophet was asked about it, and we know his response, and then he went on to mention two, and that's a separate discussion. But throughout the course of Islamic history, the scholars, for the most part, just gathered the signs of the end of time. And then they classified them into minor signs that have happened, minor signs that have yet to happen, and then once they happen, will continue to happen, and then the 10 major signs that are like 10 beads, and then once you let the bead go, that all 10 happen consecutive in a fairly short period of time. And then when you look at more modern scholarship on this science, is that some of them refer to it as what is called fiqh at-tahawulat, literally the science of changing circumstances. And just as Iman, Islam, and Ihsan throughout the historical development came to be known as different things like Aqidah, Fiqh, and Tasawwuf, and so forth and so on. There's many other terms that could be mentioned there. This is one of the ways that modern scholars have called the signs of the end of time, the science of changing circumstances, and some will add was sunnat and mawaqif. And the sunnah of mawaqif are stances that are taken. Now, ultimately, they root this into the early prophetic period in the way that was mentioned with the statements of our Prophet that indicated change. Now, when they speak about this, they speak about this fourth dimension as the rukn al-hadam, that is the pillar that undermines the first three. Literally, hadam is destruction, but hadam here means that to the degree that the first three are undermined. And what they indicate is that the Prophet ﷺ that foretold that there would be changes in the world. And so oftentimes when we talk about modernity, we sometimes fall into the trap in thinking this is the first challenge that has ever fallen the Muslim world. You'd be surprised how many people fall into that trap. Challenges are not new to our religion. They happened from the earliest period. And at first they might have been political, but then led to the theological and a long list of others. Generation, there was always people brought forward, as was prophesied by Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, to deal with those challenges. And the challenges of modernity that challenges that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has brought forth and continues to bring forth people to deal with. And so from this perspective, scholars like to quote the blessed hadith of our Prophet ﷺ about the rungs of the ladder of Islam. لَتُنْقَدَنَّ عُرُدَ Islam. That indeed that the rungs of the ladder, that in brackets of Islam, because I think it helps to see it in this particular way, urwatan urwa, the rungs of the ladder of Islam will break rung after rung. كُلَّمَنْ قَضَتْ عُرْوَةٌ, every time that a rung breaks, تَمَسَّكَ النَّاسِ بِالَّتِي تَلِيهَا, that people will hang on and grab onto the next rung. But then our Prophet ﷺ mentions two. أَوَّلُهُنَ نَقْدًا الْحُكُمْ. The first to break would be governance. وَآخِرُهُنَ نَقْدًا الصَّلَاةِ. The last to break would be prayer. And then is that this is the job of the ulama, is to determine between governance and prayer, the most outward manifestation of religion too, that even though that all acts of worship also have a social dimension to them, but prayer ultimately is something between you and Allah. It does have a social dimension, of course. But look at what our Prophet did. Now, think about all of the other rungs of the ladder of Islam that our Prophet foretold is that this was going to happen. Now, it's difficult to tie these exactly to every period. This is dhanni. This would be something that would be a degree of probability for someone to do this, but it doesn't prevent us from trying to do so. Understanding the various periods of Islam through this prophetic lens, and understanding that it's going to reach a point where there's going to be that dysfunctionality in the Muslim community, in the Muslim world, in the Muslim polity, to the extent that the only rung that they have to hang on to is prayer. Now, there's a lot of details there, but for time's sake, we will move on. This is an example of a mechanism for you and I to understand changing circumstances. And when they speak about what are called mutaghayyirat or that tahawalat, is that they also tend to speak about thawabit. And these thawabit are what are called unchanging principles. And for those that want to use this word tradition, this word is a slippery slope and has been understood in many different ways by many different people. I tend to like to point to the Latin root of traditio, this idea of handing something down, which one of the closest corollaries that in our religion, I believe, would be that talaqqi, this idea of personal instruction, where you have a living and very real connection to the living chain of transmission back to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. This is perhaps one of the greatest defining characteristics of what is truly traditional and what is not, if we're going to paint these broad strokes. And what is understood there is that, and this is important, and if we take it back to the multiple verses that mention the vocation of our Prophet ﷺ, which is a very good word. We shouldn't think of this only in the sense of that working with your hands. Vocation in the English language that originally meant a spiritual calling. And our Prophet surely had a vocation. كَمَا أَرْسَلْنَا فِيكُمْ رَسُولًا مِنْكُمْ. Just as we have sent a messenger, just as we have sent that a messenger among you, يَتْلُو عَلَيْكُمْ آيَاتِنَا. يَتْلُو عَلَيْكُمْ آيَاتِنَا. That he recites to you our revelation, or that our verses referring to the Quran. And then we go on to learn that he purifies us and teaches us the book and the wisdom. What was one of the many wisdoms why Allah first mentioned Yatlu alaykum? He recites to you. This points to this talaqi, this personal instruction, that connection to the chain. That this, if you will, that part of the oral tradition, which incidentally, it's very important to note that the oral, that transmission of the Quran precedes the written transmission. And the oral transmission is what enables us to make sure that the written, that aspect of the transmission is authentic. And this is something for me as a convert, someone that came from Protestant Christianity and from people who don't really memorize their book nor recite it. It might be read, but the Bible is surely not recited in the same way, is that this is very important, because this opens up to the door to the next point that I'd make if we were speaking about tradition, and we were speaking about this idea of talaqi, personal instruction. We can borrow here from something that you would find in the books of Ilm al-Kalam, where that the scholars of theology, to roughly refer to Kalam, although it's not that exactly equated to theology, but for layman purposes, let's call it theology, is that they said there's two different ways of coming to know Allah. And the first is to reflect, what they called nadar, and to reflect upon the creation of heavens and the earth, and to come to the conclusion that it must have a maker, it must have a creator. And that uncreated creator who brought this into existence must have certain attributes. So there's existence, and then there's beginninglessness, and then there's endlessness, and then there's the other sifat that's salbi, and then they add to that the other that traits of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But they said there was also another way. And this was the primary way that not only the companions, but most people in human history were granted faith, given that faith is a God-given gift. And this was their interaction with the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. That how did Sayyidina Abu Bakr Siddiq become a Siddiq, spoken here just not in the broadest sense of his epithet being the ultimate confirmer of truth, but understanding the Siddiq as the highest degree of validation by Allah that someone who's not a prophet can possibly receive. It was directly related to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. And so in this regard, there is a narration, and some of the more that spiritually inclined that theologians would mention this in their commentaries on books like Jawhar al-Tawheed, where there's a famous statement of Sayyidina Abu Bakr Siddiq, Araftu Rabbi bi Rabbi. I knew my Lord through my Lord. In other words, he didn't use the creation to come to know Allah. He knew Allah first, and then because he was witnessing the divine impact upon creation, he then saw everything in creation as a manifestation of one of the names and attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That is a very different process. And if I can say anything with less than a minute left, is that I really think for our time, if we're going to talk about navigating the challenges of modernity, I really truly believe that we need to be on two fronts at the same time. Is that you and I must interact with the reality of our time, understand that it is not new. And as we learn about the time in which we live, using our minds, deflecting, and primarily this is a process of deflecting, that so that you and I don't fall into the trap of a wrong way of thinking that could then affect our behavior, but also putting ourselves in a position by that sitting before realized masters of this tradition, the fruits of which can be seen in its efficacy. That's a very fancy word that simply means is that this tradition is real. When you sit before a realized master, and Imam Ghazali says it's about every trait of character. It's not just about that trait of character. It opens up a door for you to know God. Every trait of character opens up a door for you to know God. There is an efficacy to this tradition. And when you sit before the realized masters, while that also learning about your time to ward off some of its potential harms, this to me is one of the ways forward. This is why we speak about oftentimes in a maqasid, creating environments of learning. Environments of learning, believing, and I grew up in the Bay Area where you had so many different microclimates, and I've lived in the desert where you can have an oasis if there's water in the midst of the most desolate place on earth. If you create the right environment, is that it can bear fruits in that a very short period of time, despite the broader that zeitgeist of the time. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us tawfiq and bless us in all of our affairs. Wa sallallahu ala sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Alhamdulillahi rabbil alamin.
Jazakallahu khairan. Before we continue, I would also like to thank the sponsors of our panel. Our co-sponsors are the ISOM Islamic Society of Midwest, as well as the Respect Graduate School from Pennsylvania. May Allah grant barakah into their efforts and to all the sponsors of ISNA in this weekend that we may benefit from. Our third panelist is Sheikh Yusuf Rios. His topic will be political and fundamentalist Muslim responses to the challenges of modernity. Sheikh Yusuf has a BA in Western Philosophy and Sociology and a certificate in Cultural Studies from John Carroll University. At that time, he also attended the Borromeo Seminary for 2.5 years, where he studied Catholic theology and Catholic philosophy. After finishing his BA in Philosophy and Sociology, he completed a second BA in Islamic Studies from Islamic American University. He then studied abroad for 5 years, traditionally in Egypt, where he studied in Al-Azhar as well as other centers of learning. Sheikh Yusuf is in the process of completing an MA in Islamic Studies, and he also has training in social work, mental health, and also trauma therapy. He's also the founding member of the 3 Puerto Rican Imams Project. Currently, he is the resident scholar as well as the religious director at Respect Graduate School and Respect Masjid. Welcome, Sheikh Yusuf.
Okay. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah. Say one of the complexities of modernity is thinking that we're going to cover this subject in 10 minutes each. You know, I wanted to say that if we were in a different time period and we were looking at this prior to the 1800s, we would have a completely different understanding. And let me say that this is probably one of the most important topics. I wanted to thank all the sponsors again. One of the most important topics that we can deal with. Why? Because we're dealing with ourselves, our situation in the contemporary world, and how do we navigate it, which is we really don't like to talk about this issue much as a Muslim community. But if we were to transport ourselves out of time and we were to look at a Salahuddin al-Ayyubi or something like that, we would have a completely different response. Because in the time of Salahuddin al-Ayyubi, you have a different world. You have a world where Muslims are not talking about what their place in the contemporary idea, the global system is. And so we have to keep that in mind, that the Muslim modernity was at one time a response to how do we address decline in the Muslim community? How do we address civilizational decline? It was a different world. The Muslim world, as we inherited, was a world in which there was no borders, there was no nation state. And so we have to understand that we can't understand the contemporary age until we start going back. Modernity likes to divide things. It likes to compartmentalize things. So we're not going to understand the 20th century, the 19th century, if we don't understand the 18th century and the 17th century. And a lot of our problems began with the fall of Al-Andalus. We can talk about maybe before that, that's for a different discussion. When Al-Andalus fell, we began to see a major change in the Ottoman Empire, a major change. And so really we have to look at this about 500 years back. With the fall of Al-Andalus, really it meant that what we call today Europe was able to come into Latin America and to get gold and to get labor and to transform the destiny of Europe, to transform the destiny of European society as we knew it. From here came colonialism. And when the colonial powers established themselves, we eventually see this solidify itself in things like the League of Nations and Sykes-Picot, which basically simply put, this was the carving up of the Muslim world and the end of the Ottoman Empire, the end of the Muslims having some sort of centralized authority. This created a major problem for the Muslims. Of it was, what do we do with power? What do we do with the fact that we no longer have any control over our legal system? What do we do with it? We don't have any control over how we're going to see things. And I want to say something to you people that Islamic movements, and when we look at Islamic movements like Shah Wali Allah or like Sheikh Uthman Dan Fodio or even Sayyid Nursi, their dialogue is completely different than what we see in the 1900s. Why? Because they weren't dealing with the fact that there was an absence of a political authority. At that time, we called it the Khilafah. So that question of sovereignty became a major priority for the Muslims. It became a major priority for the Muslims. And the responses were varied. We had the response of, for instance, the Ikhwan al-Muslimin, which ISNA was born out of that. You know, we had the response of Maç Islamic, which Maç Islamic didn't really get to flourish as much. Why? Because they had to deal with the communists. The communists in the subcontinent made headway, just like they made headway in the Arab world. And so we have to realize that modernity has been very violent, extremely violent. And it imposed itself with violence and with bloodshed. And we can look anywhere. We can look in Egypt. We can look in Turkey. We can look anywhere and we'll see that the main primary targets were the scholars of Islam. And we know for a fact that after a while, when the Muslims were asleep, they woke up to a whole educational system that was placed that trained an elite group of people that eventually were there to lead this new society with new borders and new names, new countries. And that was the reality that the Islamic movements were dealing with. Did they do a good job? No. If we come to 1980 with the assassination of Sadat, it was very childish, the mindset that some of them had. They thought that if we assassinate the leader, that all of a sudden Islamic rule is going to come into play. It was not unlike what we saw with the Arab Spring. People thought that with just chanting La ilaha illallah wa Muhammad Rasulullah, that automatically the rule was going to change. They didn't consider the fact of modernity. Who's going to keep the electric on? Who's going to keep the gas on? Who's going to pay the checks? They didn't consider all of these realities. Realities that by this time, the Muslims were not really thinking of. But the Muslims never lost the idea of how can we be in charge of our affairs. That's really the question of the political realm. Some lost the big vision, which was the revival of Islam as a whole that we would see with a Shah Wali Allah or even with a Salahuddin al-Ayyubi or Sheikh Uthman Dan Fodio, who, by the way, was outside of modernity and still dealt with the same questions, women's issues, the issue of how do we transfer Islam in the educational system, how do we build a just society. You know, these are realities, people, that were there. Islamic movements today have a lot of maturing to do. And mostly I would say this, why? Because many of the Islamic movements are led by professionals with a Western education who think that is enough to just talk about the state and political power. And it's not. And so what has happened is that within Islamic movements, there's been a decline. There's been a decline in values. There's been a decline in understanding. But don't blame them so much. We can take them to task for their mistakes, but these are Muslims that want to see Muslim sovereign. That's just the bottom line of the question. You know, how do we get sovereignty? And they do it in the context of nation states in which we're finding corruption. We're finding an imposition of a new value system in which poverty is dominant, in which a lot of the contemporary issues are there. So they don't have the solutions, but they have an aspiration, right? And that's really the failure of the Islamic movements, that they claim to have a solution in a world which is already gone, a world which was dominated by a Khilafah figure, right? The contemporary issues today will require all of us, all of traditional societies, not just the Muslims. When we look at the reality of the world, when we look at China, or when we look at what's going on in Africa right now, all of traditional societies have been completely transformed by modernity. But when we talk about modernity and the transformation, what are we talking about? An idea of reason which was not dominant in the past, instrumental reason, that we are going to take our thinking and how to transform the world and how to get better at fishing. We're going to take our thinking and create an atom bomb. The thinking that has gone into manipulating the world and dominating the world. This has been the thinking that has been spread all over the place. So now human beings are not valued as human beings. They're valued as commodities. That thinking has transformed the world everywhere, people. So it's not just the Muslims that are facing this question of power. Even in this country right now, there's a big values debate about the direction that this country is going in. The idea of, do we need to have God back in the picture? This is really where traditional societies were at. They had God in the picture. They weren't perfect societies. They had a lot of issues. But at the end, what we are facing right now is the fact that there's a type of reason that has dominated the world, which we call modernity, or we can say is part of post-modernity, but it has undermined the understanding that human beings have had, which is God at the center, family life, that life has meaning and value, and everything has been shifted to a type of reason that says, well, look, you're somebody if you have, you're somebody if you own this, you're somebody if you're with the trends, right? That's where the Islamists have not been able to really address that issue. They talked about the question of power, and they're not able to deal with the question of power because, after all, the question of power, it has gone into the hands of people that have built a system to maintain a structure and a way of looking at things, which doesn't have much to do with the values which Sheikh Yahya has talked about, right? If we're going to build new movements, and we've seen them, we've seen the work of people like Fethullah Gulen, we've seen the work of people like we mentioned, like the Ikhwan. As much as the criticism that the Ikhwan get, the Ikhwan within themselves have had massive debates. They have failures, but the Ikhwan were the first to go against the fundamentalists. When Sayyid Qutb talked about leveling society through violence, the Ikhwan were the ones to respond first. But see, when we talk about fundamentalism, it is a bunch of Muslims that aspire to free the Muslim societies, but they want to do it by violence. And of course, majority of the Ummah doesn't believe in that. If that were the case, we would see destruction in the Muslim world for years after years. We saw a community that was looking at being patient, right? But our patience as Muslims has to push us into the patience to think about where we fit in the world today. Modernity is a phase in human history. We can transform the world, but we can't transform the world if we only have a piecemeal way of looking at it. And initially, we as Muslims, we understood life, religious life, to be life as a whole, every aspect of life, economy, the political realm, the realm of arts, the realm of the soul. And until we get to that type of thinking again, what does it mean to be Muslims in all of those dimensions? We're never going to have a response to modernity that's going to meet our needs as Muslims or any other religious community. And remember that this question of modernity, it started with the problems of faith and reason in Europe, and it was imposed on the rest of the world. It started with the Catholic Church not being able to respond to the needs of his people, or the Catholic Church restricting reason. And it started with corrupt leaders not caring about their people. So the way that we use reason, and the way that we use religion, and the way that we as Muslims talk about justice will really speak to whether we care about addressing modernity or not. And with that, we come to an end.
Jazakallahu khairan, Shaykh Yusuf. Our final speaker is Dr. Adnan Aslan with his topic, Perennialist Response to Modernity. Professor Adnan Aslan was born in Turkey, received an educated in Turkey and in England. His master's degree was from the Department of History and Philosophy at King's College in London, and then his PhD later on from the Religious Studies Department at Lancaster University in England. He's published several scholarly articles, encyclopedia entries, book chapters, books in English and in Turkish in various disciplines, especially in the field of philosophy of religion. He is currently the Dean of Academics at Respect Graduate School in Pennsylvania. We welcome you, Dr. Adnan Aslan.
Okay. Thank you very much, Chaplain Sakina. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'een. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Brothers and sisters, scholars, and dear respected friends, because I have 10 minutes, I need to be very precise. That is why I'm going to read from the text to be precise and, not time consuming. Today, I'm going to talk about the perennial philosophy as a response to the challenges of modernity. Let me briefly summarize a philosophical vision of perennial philosophy. It assumes the precedence of ontology over epistemology. It means that reality was essentially given by revelation. This is very important because in modernity, this is not very much accepted as a revelation, as a source of knowledge. It envisages a hierarchical concept of reality. In perennial philosophy, divine being was considered as the source of all kinds of existence, whether spiritual, material, animate, inanimate. On the other hand, modern epistemology has caused a great paradigm shift in the nature of the knowledge. As Schumacher demonstrates well, the change of Western man's interest from the slanderous knowledge that may be obtained of the higher things, that is the quotation from Thomas Aquinas, to the mathematically precise knowledge of the lesser things marks a change from what we call it science for understanding to science for manipulation. So this is a very important paradigm shift in the modernity, from the science for understanding to the science for manipulation. The purpose of former was the enlightenment of the person and his liberation. The purpose of latter is the power. So science of understanding, the purpose of science of understanding is liberation and enlightenment, salvation, that is related with the hereafter. Science for manipulation is aimed to the power. That is why knowledge itself is power, said Francis Bacon. In its further development, science for manipulation almost inevitably tends to advance from the manipulation of nature, that of the people. So it is not remains there. It goes further, and manipulation of the people and manipulation of the nature. As is the case when the modern sciences are subordinated to the wisdom, no harm can come of it. However, when wisdom disappears in the field of sciences because people cease to be interested in its pursuit, the cost would be heavy, causing many social, psychological, even environmental problems. What it is claimed here, my dear friends, so wisdom has been disappeared in the science, in the field of knowledge. The cost is heavy. As Schumacher stated, the science for understanding saw man as made in the image of God, the growing glory of creation, hence in charge of the world, because nobility oblige, honorable obligation. The science of manipulation inevitably sees man as nothing but accidental product of evolution, a higher animal, a social animal, an object for study by the same methods by which other phenomena of the world were to be studied objectively. Perennial philosophy offers an alternative culture. Perennial philosophy believes that all existence is a manifestation or point on the continuum of hierarchical ordered reality. In such a vision, there is no room for dualism of psychological, cosmological kind, which has been real source of alienation. Hence, individuals, according to their level in communication with the higher consciousness as a source of reality, can move towards the more sustained awareness of unity. So the whole purpose of this world is the unity. And perennial understanding offers the way how can we unite. This unity is all-encompassing. Unity within society as well as unity humanity with humanity, unity with all creations, finally aiming at final unity, that is unity with ultimate reality. The second important response from the perennial philosophy is related with the human being. Karl Jaspers underlines the limits of modern disciplines in understanding human beings. He says, psychology studied him as a body, physiology studies him as a body, psychology as a soul, sociology as a social being. Our study of man has brought us many kinds of knowledge, but knowledge of man as a whole. So we do not have knowledge of man as a whole. So physiology studies body, psychology studies soul, sociology studies a social being, and history studies as an action, as an agent in the history. But we do not have the discipline which covers and which to covers the man as a whole. So the response probably comes from the say Nas. To be human is to know and also to transcend oneself. Man arafa rabbahu faqad man arafa nafsahu faqad arafa rabbahu. The hadith says, whoever knows himself knows his Lord. According to Islamic tradition, self-knowledge is the prerequisite of all moral and spiritual development. Without knowing and discovering our inner being, we cannot assume any moral and spiritual development at all. Critiques raised by the perennial philosophy concerning modern science are primarily centered around its autonomy, purpose, and secular attributes. Firstly, science derives its credibility from its inherent characteristics, not relying on any specific tradition, religion, or external principles. The perennialists argue that science, along with the other human pursuits, should be rooted in the revealed principles. This is the most important thing. So almost all sciences, I would assume, they have the secular characteristics. So in order to overcome that secular characteristics, all the human sciences and the actions, it has to be rooted into the divine, it has to be rooted in the revealed principles. So, in my opinion, perennial philosophy boasted several compelling strengths. Nevertheless, it also exhibits certain weakness. Notably, it tends to elitist and intellectually oriented, which has resulted in its limited resources among the Muslim masses. What I am trying to say here, although it has a very high-level intellectual response, but he cannot really take ground into the Muslim masses. Doesn't address the Muslim population. Notably, it tends to be elitist and intellectual oriented, which has resulted in its limited resource among the Muslim masses. Like modernist liberal Islam, Even within the intellectual circles, the perennial philosophy seems to be concluding it is historical significance, as there is a noticeable absence of younger generations adhering to the figure like Ganon, Shaun, and Sayyid Hussein Nasr. I hold the perspective that the rejuvenation of the Islamic world necessitates more than just intellectual endeavor. It should also encompass a spiritual initiative that resonates with the broader Muslim populace. In my view, the revivalist approach within Islam, originating from Ghazali and extending to the Said Nursi, present the most viable pathway for the restoration of the Islamic world. Additionally, I believe that Hizmet movement, grounded in the philosophy of Said Nursi, has launched a social religious movement capable of providing ethical, spiritual, intellectual, and institutional responses to the challenges posed by the modernity. Thank you very much for listening.
Jazakallah khairan. Thank you very much, Dr. Adnan, Aslan. We, in the interest of time, what we've agreed to do is take a couple of questions at once, and then the speakers will kind of consolidate and respond together. So anyone who has a question ready, yes, please, go ahead. One, maybe we'll take three. I think we'll take three real quick and then consolidate a response.
You may have to repeat the question.
Yes, I'll repeat, inshallah, if I can hear. Would you mind standing, please? Yeah.
In regards to, you mentioned that the first kind of change that comes about is government, and then prayer is the last. And you mentioned in terms of following kind of spiritual guide, master. My question is, do you think that what we call here in English brotherhood, but tariqas, that will act as some kind of step into the government and help mobilize people on a civil level? Because I understand that following a shaykh on a personal sense and following a spiritual master for kind of surviving modernity. Do you think that could work as well? Because I know Adnan went on, became he entered into a religion as well. So do you think that that kind of institution can act as a substitute for government today? Because so many of these attempts to put Muslims in power in government tend to end up kind of backfiring.
In summary, correct me if I'm wrong, the question generally is asking, is it possible for a sense of a personal tariqah to kind of take the place or substitute a government in the context of a movement or a structure facing modernity? Okay. Question two. Well, we'll take one more. You had one. We only have literally like 5 minutes. I'm sorry. Yes, what organizer says? Two more? Okay. And I think you had your hand. Do we have a mic? We don't have another microphone, yeah? At the back? No? Go ahead. Go ahead. One other criticism.
Just say it quickly.
We don't. How do we respond to critics on the topic of, for example, following and choosing a single school of fiqh, when all of them are right? Okay. And the third one here last.
My question is, how the Muslims should use the mechanism of ijtihad as a leverage of arising problems caused by the modernity?
How Muslims can use the mechanism of ijtihad as a leverage in problems brought by modernism. Modernity, yes, the condition. There's no microphone. Can I separate these mics, or are they like attached to? Because there's two here.
One of them for video.
So I cannot. Okay.
Yeah, Bismillah. So just a very brief response that I'm very interested to hear Dr. Hermanson's response as well on this. Just a point of clarification, I wasn't, when I spoke about talaqi, that is personal instruction, specifically referring to masters of the spiritual paths, although that could potentially be included in that broader rubric. I was more referring to, in the broadest sense, the scholarly chains of transmission back to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, in all of the various sciences, which include ilm al-kalam, which include the science of fiqh, which include the science of tasawwuf, and all the other sharia science, including all the ancillary disciplines, the ulum al-alat. That's what I was broadly referring to as the traditions, that these chains of transmission and connection back to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And I think in that regard is also the answer to the brother's question. That's a very deep, involved question. You'd have to that get into a lot of details there. But I think it's important to have a balanced understanding for those that counter that allegation, is that they would simply say is that this is the way, is that the Sharia has been preserved, is through these scholarly chains of transmission that so happen to be that even there could have been 20 schools, is that the 4 schools that have been preserved over the years are the 4 schools as we know them. And thus is that even though that they don't equate directly to the Sharia, they are valid manifestations of mujtahideen that had an usul, that whereby which is that rulings were extrapolated from the Quran and the Sunnah primarily, and then 2 other ways, which is ijma and then that qiyas, analogical reasoning. So I think the question really is that in relation to schools of thought, is that even those that want to choose particular opinions, they all eventually go back to the opinions of all of the imams. And I think that's important to note. And that what they felt that was more important, instead of just kind of cherry picking and not being qualified to actually that say that this proof is stronger than this one, is that they trusted the authorities. And that actually that say that this proof is stronger than this one, is that they trusted the authorities. And that would be our response to that type of question. But I think it's important to note is that these same scholars would say, "Man laqiya man qallada aliman laqiya Allah saliman," is that as long as someone follows qualified scholarship of some sort, is that this is what is required. So the madhab of the Ami is the people that they learn from. And so we have to be totally balanced in all of these affairs. And I think what happens when people are that fanatical, this is what creates dissension.
Because the Sheikh asked me to say something quickly and try to address both the question about ijtihad and modernity, and also the question about tariqas or Sufi sheikhs or ulama, and the possibility for that kind of perhaps more intimate and direct transmission of knowledge to translate into some kind of movement that could actually impact the broader society. And just thinking on the wing here, I think 2 kind of key concepts that we need to think about are authority and authenticity. Because take ijtihad, for example, today. Many governments or other bodies have tried to create like fiqh councils or groups of scholars that could come up with broader rulings on questions that impact the lives of Muslims. So on the one hand, you could say that's a very positive development. Some Muslim scholars envisioned, like the late Dr. Hamidullah, that this could be a kind of global thing. You know, this could almost be a way to unite Muslims, that you would have these scholars from all around the world who would come together and come up with these rulings. But again, there's kind of the downside, because often, as many of you may know, in Muslim nations, there's the government fiqh council, and people are rather suspicious that perhaps the government is manipulating the kind of decisions that would be made. You know, so again, I'm saying this question of authority, do people really trust? And what is that connection? And I think that also goes back to this idea of receiving the authentic knowledge. Because after all, we live in an era of mass communication and immediacy, and the tradition, perennialists and traditionalists may say, well, wait a minute, you can't take baya online, right? You can't take initiation online, or if you listen to something on the internet, right? Everybody is watching their favorite sheikh on YouTube. But is that gonna, does that sort of become a substitute for transmission? Or in a way, is it really a blessing? Because you might be in a remote place. You might never find that scholar, so I think we are all facing, I don't have like the answer, like this is good, this is bad, do this, do that. But I suppose if if done with sincerity and intention to please Allah and to find the truth, inshallah, both the person, I think it has to start with the person, but maybe I'm a bit Sufi inclined. I'm a bit distrustful of the movements, because I think many movements, people in, human beings, right? They want to be the leader of the movement, or they want to get power or something, and they haven't done the heavy lifting about their own personal, their own personal service. Right? Because as long as you want something for you to get out of doing this thing, then it's eventually going to get sour. It's not going to lead it forward. So inshallah, may Allah give us all hidayat. Ameen. Thank you.
So I have 1 minute now. I want to answer gentleman's question. So it's a very good question. So what I would like to say, let me summarize two important challenges: philosophical challenges and institutional challenges. We have not responded to the philosophical challenges of the modernity. In the past, we did. We had our own philosophers, responding to Aristotle. But after Descartes, we don't have the Muslim philosopher responding to the challenges of the modernity. Second, institutional challenges was very strong. I mean, modern education, modern art, modern economic system. We don't have anything which really responds such institutional challenges. We were always concentrated on the personal development. This is a certain limit. After that, you need to face with the great challenges. Okay, thank you very much.
I think we need a movement for ISNA to have longer panel sessions. Jazakumullahu khairan, everyone. Thank you for your patience. May Allah Al-Alim, the source of all knowledge, grant barakah in our presence here today, and may Allah accept all the sacrifice and investments of the thousands of people who are here trying to gain ilm and companionship in His name. Thank you, Jazakumullahu khairan. Thank you to the sponsors, Islamic Society of Midwest and Respect Graduate School. We also have brochures of Respect Graduate School at the back if you're interested in a Master's of Islamic Studies, and you can learn from Dr. Aslan and some of our other scholars as well. And we have a booth, yes. Our booth is at 1625, in between all those